Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to revisit a Lennon album from 1975, and it's John Lennon's Rock N Roll. Now, this album had been started in '73 after Mind Games in Los Angeles with Phil Spector at the helm, but those sessions had broken down and they'd only recorded a handful of tracks, and Lennon returned to those tapes and embellished them and recorded new versions and sort of new tracks and fleshed out the album and made an album of it with his Walls and Bridges session musicians. And then it was released in February '75, and it's fairly well regarded by the fan base. Not everyone loves it, but it did get to number 6 on both sides of the Atlantic, which is not brilliant by solo Beatles standards, but compared to, say, George Harrison, whose Dark Horse album, released in December of '74, had even failed to chart completely, although it did get to number 4 in the US. So Lennon was, even though he'd been absent from the UK for a good 3 years, he was still charting in workmanlike fashion. Certainly albums were doing okay. Walls and Bridges also got to number 6. Singles-wise, Stand By Me came from this album as a single, got to number 20 in the US, number 30 in the UK, which is not very good at all. Whatever Gets Through the Night, interesting contrast this, number 1 in the US, number 36 in the UK, that is very poor. Number 9, Dream, again, I think that top 10 in the US, number 9, and about number 23 in the UK, so he wasn't doing so well chart-wise, no doubt not helped by the fact that he wasn't around in London to appear in promotional material. Although for this album, interestingly, he did do 2 proper promo videos. And when I say proper promo videos, he had attempted a promo video for Mind Games and Whatever Gets Through the Night, but they were kind of very hastily put together and just sort of featured sort of stock footage and sort of footage of him wandering around. But this was a proper recording of Lennon in the Hit Factory singing along to the backing track, and actually had the band mime the backing track as well. So, and they were filmed, and they're delightful, although they're just straight performances for the most part. They were delightful, and they were shown on the Old Grey Whistle Test, and also Bob Harris, because Bob Harris, the presenter of Old Grey Whistle Test, had flown to New York and did a very good interview with John at the time as well. So that must have been a great sort of edition of Old Grey Whistle Test if you were a Lennon fan in the UK. Anyway, I digress. So this album had been started in October '73 at the A&M studios in Hollywood with Phil Spector and a whole mountain of musicians. I mean, I think if you look on Wikipedia, you can, although it's not credited on the album who played on which track or even who played at all. I think various books have tried to sort of say who played, and you've got about 50 musicians, with not really exaggerating when I say that. It's sort of Hal Blaine on drums. I think Carl Radle was even rumoured to have taken part, but I don't think he's credited on Wikipedia. But there's a whole host of other people, apart from the sort of Jesse Ed Davis and Jim Keltner. You've got all the sort of Phil Spector sort of circle of friends, circle of musicians, and by all accounts those sessions in Los Angeles were fairly riotous, and Lennon and Spector were drinking heavily, and Spector was known to fire a gun at the ceiling, and not much fun, and not much came out of it in terms of sort of releasable material. And then if you listen to some bootlegs, Lennon was incredibly drunk recording one version of Just Because, which thankfully didn't see the light of day officially. But anyway, the Spector sessions did produce some good material. You Can't Catch Me, Sweet Little 16, Boney Maroney and Just Because did make the final album, although at least in the case of Just Because, I think Lennon might have had to re-record the vocal. I'm not actually sure about that because it's not documented whether he re-recorded the vocal for all of the Spector tracks or just one of them or 2 of them. It's quite frustrating in that respect that this album doesn't tell you more But this is my UK original with the apple in a sleeve. Not very exciting, no goodies, no lyric sheet, no musician credits here. But I've got 3 copies of this album. This is my German copy. And on the Gemma label, which is always nice to have. And then, sorry, Gemma Apple label, still on Apple. And then we've got my Yugoslav copy now. This is interesting because this came out in the early 80s, I think. But what's interesting for this is it's got the darkest apple we'll ever see. I mean, that is just almost not an apple. But I always like to see, if you watch my channel, I always like to see different shades of apple. So those my 3 copies. But one of the reasons I've decided to do this review is because I've had a little bit of an overdose of introspective Lennon. You know, the Lennon material, well, particularly with the recent Mind Games release, one can get a little bit, not fed up is the wrong word, but a little bit of an overdose of what I call introspective Lennon with a message, whether it be political, whether it be philosophical, whether it be for Yoko or love songs. So that side of his career, which is sometimes a little bit serious. And then you've got something like this, rock and roll, which is just altogether unpretentious, lacking in any illusions of grandeur, and is just him having fun. And it's sometimes, as a listener, you need that kind of release and or light relief, if you want to call it that. And I find the same, you know, sometimes when I've had a bit too much of the serious Lennon, I will sometimes sort of switch to Ringo just for some light relief as well. But in the case of Lennon, I think rock and roll is a perfect example of him just having fun, and it really comes out in the grooves of the record or the CD or whatever you're listening to. So that was the inspiration behind this review. A lot of tracks were laid down in the Spectre sessions which didn't originally see the light of day, which have since come out. So we've got Be My Baby, which appeared on Lennon Anthology in 1998, this superb compilation which I go back to a hell of a lot. The good thing about that compilation is it doesn't duplicate other stuff which has been released before or since. It's just unique, really. It's just got a whole 4 discs of outtakes, and it's a very good standalone package which has lasted the test of time. So that's on there. This album from 1986, Menlove Avenue, which Yoko released posthumously. Side 1 is made up of virtually rock and roll session outtakes, including, there's a Lennon Spectre track called Here We Go Again, with the whole sort of sea of musicians, which is, I have to say, pretty unmemorable. But it's interesting to hear once or twice. And then you've got Rock and Roll People, which is an outtake from the Mind Games album, which has recently been released. You can hear it on the deluxe set, and it's on Spotify. But it's a pretty much of a throwaway track, and he gave it to Johnny Winter. I just listened to Johnny Winter's version, and it's pretty terrible as well. It's just it's Lennon's, one of his worst compositions. And talking of which, he also wrote a song about this time called Move Over Miss L, which he gave to Keith Moon, who recorded it for his Two Sides of the Moon solo album. He didn't do a very good version of it. Lennon did a better version of it. Again, the one on Anthology is the best, in my opinion. Then he released it as the B-side of Stand By Me. But he overproduced it, and he, rather annoyingly, as John has a habit of doing, mixed his vocal very low. Anyway, back to Menlove Avenue. So we've got Angel Baby, which somehow missed the cut. It was on the bootleg version of the album, the Morris Levy version, but it missed the official album. And I just don't know why, because I think it's probably in my top 5 tracks from these sessions. And I think Sean must have realised this because he put it out on Give Me Some Truth as a track. It's just wonderful, sort of anthemic song, and by all accounts, I don't think I've listened to the original, but by all accounts the original is a bit kind of soppy, and sort of Lennon transforms it, Lennon and Spector together transform it into this kind of big opus. So that really works. Since My Baby Left Me as a kind of call and response number, I think Elvis did this number, and leaves me pretty much cold. I played it once or twice when this album came out. Reasonably interesting packaging, I suppose, but no inner sleeve or anything. This is on the Parlophone label. So a little bit of a pointless release. I mean, although at the time I suppose I was happy to get these unreleased tracks, but the whole of side 2 is made up of outtakes from Walls and Bridges, which is just not really, I'm not sure what the relevance of that is to side 1. But anyway, side 1 finishes with To Know Her Is To Love Her, the Phil Spector song, which he'd recorded in the early 60s. And Lennon does a very ponderous version of this, and it's interesting to compare that ponderous Lennon version to the Beatles' sort of happy-go-lucky, upbeat rendition they did on the BBC radio, which is on the Beatles at the Bee album, which is much more successful with Paul and George on backing vocals. But here he turns it into a dirge, I'm sorry to say. Anyway, talking of Anthology, this disc, I think it's disc 3, the Lost Weekend disc, has alternate versions of several tracks from rock and roll, including Slipping and a Sliding, without the horns. So you can hear Kenny Ash's piano higher in the mix. You can hear the band, the Walls and Bridges band, who are really cooking. And it's just very interesting to hear that. Exactly the same with Bring It All Home to Me, Bring It On Home to Me, should I say, without the horns. Just hear the band, and Send Me Some Loving, the same part of that medley. Peggy Sue, slightly alternative version of that, nothing much different there, but Rip It Up, Ready Teddy. By the way, I was noticing that, or someone I was reading, that on some copies of the album Ready Teddy, it was billed as Ready Teddy, Rip It Up, instead of Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, but on that press, all these pressings, it's got it correct, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy. But anyway, back to the Anthology version of this. It's got, Ready Teddy was reduced to like 1.5 minutes on the album, but on the Anthology it's like 2.75 minutes, and it's got an extra couple of verses, and just fascinating to hear that, and I can't think why Lennon left it out. If I had to do my alternative track listing of this album, I would have included the extended version of this, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, and I would have included Angel Baby, and I would have got rid of You Can't Catch Me, because I think it's a monotonous version of, I don't know if I've listened to the original, but the reason he did it is because he was getting sued by Maurice Levy for nicking a line from the song, Here Come All Flat Top, for Come Together. But I think it's not one of Chuck Berry's best. But it's interesting how, so that's the track I would have left off. There's not much else I could have left off, to be honest with you. I think it's most of the other, Do You Want to Dance, perhaps, is a bit dispensable. But I'm not sure if Be My Baby is quite worthy of release. It's a bit failed as an attempt. They make it try to sound grand and big, but it doesn't quite come off. So I'm quite happy with the track listing, really, for the most part. But it's interesting how these tracks literally were some of the first tracks that Lennon got into when he discovered rock and roll. So we've got Bebop-A-Lula. Oh, by the way, Anthology has take 2 of Bebop-A-Lula with an alternative guitar solo from Jesse Ed Davis, or slightly different. So yeah, that's very interesting. Back to the song, Gene Vincent, 1956. Stand By Me was a little bit later. That didn't come out till 61, Benny King's version. Rip It Up is from Little Richard, 1956. You Can't Catch Me, Chuck Berry, 1956. So this is when Lennon was a very impressionable 16-year-old. And Ain't That a Shame, 1955, that he said that was the first song he could play on his own, accompanying himself, and his mother taught him the chords on the banjo. And as we know, Lennon's mother would not live much longer. I think she died she was killed by an off-duty policeman hit by a car in 1958. So this song in 1955, and fond memories for John, no doubt. And the same with Boney Maroney. That was one of the first tracks he remembers, and he remembers performing that song in front of his mother. I think it was at Woolton Church Fete, the day he met Paul McCartney. So those songs have very deep meaning for him. Do You Want to Dance, Bobby Freeman, number 1958. Sweet Little 16 is Chuck Berry, 1958, and it's interesting what Lennon and Spector did. They slowed it down, and I think it works tremendously. And I think the original version is quite good, but I'm glad for the most part, he tries to do something different, a little bit different, with the arrangement. I mean, in something like Bebopaloola, he's doing it pretty much straight, but that works. But in the case of Stand By Me, he's adding little idiosyncrasies to make it interesting, and it really elevates his version of the song to almost, in the case of Stand By Me, a lot of people think it is the definitive version, including myself. So Sweet Little 16, I think Spector and Lennon did a good job, and I don't know if he re-recorded the vocals when he came to New York or not, but it's got great use of horns, and it's a good chugging slow number. Slipping and a Sliding, Little Richard, 1956, great version of that, and a great video, as I said earlier. Peggy Sue, Buddy Holly, 1957. Not much care for this version of Peggy Sue. I think it's a little bit kind of, there's too much going on in the mix, even though Spector had nothing to do with it. There's too much echo, and Lennon's voice is too much down in the mix. That's the only advantage of the version on here, is that you can hear Lennon's voice more clearly. Bringing It On Home to Me and Send Me Some Loving. I'm not sure if it was recorded as a medley, but on the Anthology, without the horns, it's presented as a medley there. So Sam Cooke number, Bringing It Home to Me, 1962. Little Richard, Send Me Some Loving, 1957. Larry Williams did Boney Maroney, 1957, and Larry Williams also wrote Slow Down, which the Beatles covered, and Bad Boy, which the Beatles covered, and Dizzy Miss Lizzy, which the Beatles covered. To me, Boney Maroney is the best track on the album. I absolutely love it. Play It Loud, lovely electric guitar. Lennon's absolutely singing his heart out. Whereas Ya Ya, the next track, I don't think it works very well. It's a bit too jaunty in its production. Lee Dorsey song from 1961. And Just Because is a track that Lennon didn't even know, and Spector brought it to his attention. It's an independent label number from Lloyd Price, who wrote the song and sang it 1957. And it's actually very appropriate for Lennon to be singing that song if you listen to the words, because not only had he split up with Yoko, but he was also just about to take 5 years sabbatical from the music business, and he's saying this farewell speech at the end, recorded in LA the back end of 73, and he wouldn't actually take time off for another 18 months, but it was quite prophetic in what he says, and there's a good sort of little alternative reprise of Just Because on the 2004 CD, which is the best one to get, along with the Mind Games. This is the one to get, the Yoko supervised 2004, rather than the later CDs. So that was the songs. I think I'm pretty happy with all of the songs, and as I say, it's quite sort of an uplifting album to put on. I put it on loud last night at about midnight. It's okay, I didn't wake up the neighbours or anything. I wasn't playing it too loud, but Carr and Tyler, in this superb book, they were very complimentary of this album, and they say, when it comes to the music, having discussed the background to the release, now for the music. First of all, this is a good record. Nay, a splendid one, regarded in context. Gone are the wispy inconsequentialities and peevishness of his long, drawn-out transitional period. Gone are the sloganizing, radical, chic euphemisms of the Amsterdam bed period. Altogether absent is any sign of aer lingus ad copy. Instead, the listener rejoices in the presence of unmistakable vintage Lennon singing his little scouse heart out with sentimental moisture trickling down cheeks, followed by tears of angst and pending deportation threats. It is all truly wonderful stuff, and the tracks speak for themselves, brackets or ought to. Production is uncluttered and spare, as is only right and proper, and conviction oozes from every slot of one's speaker's grills. It is an album that Lennon undoubtedly, brackets he even said as much, made as an act of self-renewal. Now, not everyone is that complimentary about this album. Some people say, what was he doing? Couldn't he write any songs? What is he falling back on a covers album? But I think I think as another review said, it's Lennon in full clover. And not that I am going to knock what Mind Games and Walls and Bridges, because if you're in the mood, they are truly stupendous efforts. But as I said, you can have a little bit too much of the self-reflective Lennon, a little bit depressed on Walls and Bridges perhaps, a little bit meandering at times and not quite sure what he wants to say, but just wonderful stuff. But then on something like Rock and Roll, there's no hidden agenda, there's no hidden meaning. It's just the tracks he grew up with, and he absolutely loves them, and it really shows. Now McCartney would try and do a couple of rock and roll albums, Chocobee CCCP in 1988 and Run Devil Run in 1999, and they had a couple of highlights I really liked. I'm Going to Be a Wheel Someday, and Don't Fool Around much anymore on Chocobee CCCP, the Russian album, and I really like Brown Eyed Handsome Man from Run Devil Run. But on the whole, I think he left it a bit late in his career for us to compare it to this, because this is 75 Lennon. If we're comparing to 75 McCartney, it would be a fair comparison, but it's a little bit unfair to compare something which came out 13 years later and then 24 years later in the case of Run Devil Run. But if you ask me to compare, as some of you probably are doing now, so I will say I prefer John Lennon's Rock and Roll album. I think it's not a flawless affair, and one could have done with a bit more information about who played what, but I'm glad he did it, and I wouldn't be without it. And there's times when putting this album, it's like the perfect tonic to cheer oneself up, or to uplift oneself if one's a little bit down. So that was John Lennon's Rock and Roll. Thank you for watching. See you next time.